I was helping my 8 months pregnant wife out of our car when a middle-aged woman in a bright floral blouse stormed out of her front door like we'd just robbed the place. She jabbed her finger toward our SUV and screeched, "You can't park here, I'm calling 911. We'd only been in the spot for 2 minutes. My wife needed to catch her breath before we went inside to visit an old friend. But Karen, as I would soon learn the neighborhood called her, wasn't interested in compassion. She dialed 911 right in front of us, making sure every neighbor within earshot knew there were suspicious people outside her house. 5 minutes later, a black police SUV rolled up, and when the commander stepped out, Karen's smug little smile disappeared. I've lived in quiet towns my whole life. After 20 years of military service deployments overseas, months away from home, and more than my fair share of chaos, all I wanted was peace. I wanted to spend my mornings in the workshop making furniture for local clients, my afternoons walking our golden retriever along tree-lined streets, and my evenings with my wife, Emily, who was expecting our first child. Emily and I had been married for 7 years, and this pregnancy was nothing short of a miracle. We'd tried for so long that we'd almost given up hope. So now, every little thing about her well-being was my top priority. If she needed to stop for a drink of water, we stopped. If she needed to rest, we rested. Nothing else mattered. That Saturday morning was one of those perfect early fall days. The air was crisp without being cold. Leaves were just starting to blush orange and red, and somewhere in the distance, the faint smell of pumpkin bread baking floated on the breeze. I was in a good mood as we drove across town to visit my old army buddy, Frank. Frank and I had been through some tough years together overseas, and now he lived just 25 minutes away. He and his wife had recently moved into one of those neatly trimmed, cookie-cutter neighborhoods that always look like they've been lifted straight out of a brochure. You know the type: identical mailboxes, lawns clipped so short they look like green carpet, and houses painted in shades of beige, gray, and cream that the HOA probably had on a master-approved list. Frank had warned me about his neighborhood's HOA the last time we spoke. He'd laughed when he said, "Watch out for Karen. She's the self-appointed sheriff around here. She's not even on the HOA board anymore, but she still walks around like she's queen of the cul-de-sac." When we arrived, Frank's driveway was full. His wife's family was visiting for the weekend, and they'd taken up every spot. The street was mostly empty except for a few parked cars in front of other houses. I found an open curbside space in front of what looked like an empty home 2 doors down from Frank's. I shifted into park, and Emily let out a relieved sigh. Long car rides weren't easy for her these days. At 8 months along, she had started experiencing shortness of breath, and her doctor had told her to rest often. I got out of the driver's seat, walked around to her side, and opened the door slowly. "Take your time," I said, offering my hand. She smiled faintly and eased herself out, one hand resting on the top of the doorframe, the other protectively over her belly. She took a deep breath of the cool air, her cheeks a little flushed from the ride. That's when I heard it, the sharp, deliberate slam of a front door. It was the kind of sound people make when they want you to know they're coming. Out marched a woman I'd never seen before, but I knew instantly that this had to be the infamous Karen Frank had warned me about. She was tall. Her blonde hair scraped back into a bun so tight it looked like it might give her a headache. She wore a loud floral blouse that clashed spectacularly with the muted tones of the neighborhood, and she moved fast heels clicking on the pavement like gunshots. "You can't park there," she barked, before I could even say hello. "This is a private neighborhood, and you're trespassing." I blinked, thrown off by the aggression. "Ma'am, this is a public street. My wife's pregnant and just needs a minute to—" She cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Don't care. Rules are rules. You people think you can just show up wherever you want. I'm calling the police." Emily's eyes widened. "We're just visiting a friend." But Karen had already pulled out her phone, thumbing the screen with the determination of someone who lived for moments like this. She turned slightly away from us but raised her voice to make sure everyone on the block could hear. "Yes. 911. I have 2 suspicious individuals outside my house. Unknown vehicle. One of them is acting aggressive." Aggressive. I looked down at myself, hands at my sides, standing a good 3 feet from her. Speaking in the calmest tone I could muster, Emily was leaning against the SUV, breathing steadily, yet, from the blinds twitching in several windows, I knew Karen's performance was landing exactly as she intended, with curiosity and suspicion from the neighbors. I tried one more time, my voice steady. "Ma'am, our friend lives right over there. We'll be on our way in just a moment." She turned her head just enough to smirk at me, then rattled off our license plate number into the phone. When she hung up, she crossed her arms, the satisfaction practically radiating off her. "Police are on their way. Hope you're ready to explain yourselves." Emily shifted uncomfortably. "Let's just leave," she whispered, her voice low so Karen couldn't hear. But I didn't move. Something in me refused to back down, not because I wanted a fight, but because I've seen what happens when you give in to bullies. They just get bolder, and I wasn't going to let some self-appointed enforcer ruin my wife's peace of mind. Karen stayed planted in the middle of the street, her eyes flicking from us to the corners of the houses where neighbors' faces hovered behind curtains. She seemed to be enjoying the attention. She didn't know I already had someone on the inside. Not just someone, the police commander of the entire department and an old friend of mine from my military days. And he was about to make an entrance she'd never forget. Karen didn't move from her spot in the middle of the street. She kept glancing at her phone as if expecting a presidential-level security detail to arrive any second. Emily leaned against the car, one hand on her belly, her breathing uneven. I could feel her stress rising, and that was the last thing I wanted. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "you're causing my wife a lot of stress. She's 8 months pregnant. Could we please just pregnant or not? The rules are the rules," Karen snapped. "You don't live here. You don't belong here. The HOA has the right to remove trespassers. And if you think your sob story will get you out of a citation, think again." She had the kind of tone that dripped with self-importance. I'd met generals who were easier to talk to. From the corner of my eye, I spotted a curtain twitch in the house across the street. A man in a baseball cap was watching us openly now, sipping from a mug. Another woman 2 doors down stepped onto her porch, folding her arms like she was settling in for the show. Karen, apparently fueled by her audience, stepped closer to our SUV. She pulled out her phone again, this time holding it up like she was filming for evidence. "I have the right to document this," she said, circling slowly toward Emily's side of the car. That was when I stepped forward, blocking her. My voice was still calm, but I let the steel edge creep in. "You're not filming my wife. Back up." She took half a step back, not much, but enough to tell me she'd registered the change in my tone. Still, she wasn't done. "I will be sending this to the HOA board," she said, lifting her chin. "We've had far too many strangers parking here lately. And you," she gestured to me, "look like the type who thinks the rules don't apply to him." I almost laughed at the absurdity. I'd spent 2 decades following rules so strict they dictated how to fold my socks. But right now, her little power trip was putting unnecessary stress on my wife and turning a peaceful visit into a public spectacle. I took a slow breath and pulled my phone from my pocket, not to call 911, but to text someone I knew would be more than happy to handle this. My thumbs moved quickly. "Hey, Mike, got a situation. HOA busybody harassing my pregnant wife. Claims we're trespassing. Can you swing by Mike? Police Commander Michael Harris wasn't just a colleague from years past. He'd been my commanding officer in Afghanistan before he retired from the Army and joined the police force. I knew he took harassment cases seriously, especially when they involved vulnerable people. Karen must have thought I was backing down when she saw me on my phone, because she turned and started addressing the growing number of neighbors peeking out. "This is what happens when you let anyone drive through here. They think they can just take over. No respect for property lines." I almost asked her what property lines she thought extended into the public street, but I let her dig her own hole. Emily shifted in the seat, wincing slightly. "My back hurts," she whispered. I crouched beside her. "Hang tight. This won't take long." She gave me a doubtful look, but before she could say anything else, the distant sound of tires crunching gravel reached us. A large black SUV, the kind the department used for command staff, rolled slowly into view at the end of the street. Karen's entire face lit up. She actually waved, like she'd summoned them herself. "Over here. Officers, I'm the one who called. The SUV pulled up behind our car." For a moment, Karen stood tall, clearly expecting backup for her crusade. Then the driver's door opened, and out stepped Mike, 6'4", broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, wearing his full uniform and dark sunglasses. He shut the door and scanned the scene, his eyes landing on me first. "John," he said, his voice carrying easily down the street. I smiled and straightened. "Hey, Mike." Karen froze. She looked from me to Mike and back again, clearly trying to piece together why the police commander of the entire department knew my name. Mike walked right past her without so much as a nod, heading straight to Emily. He crouched by her door, his tone immediately gentle. "Ma'am, are you okay? Need any medical assistance?" Emily shook her head, just a little stressed. "We were visiting a friend when this woman..." She trailed off. Glancing toward Karen, Mike stood and finally turned to face Karen. His expression was unreadable, but I'd seen that look before, calm on the surface, but dangerous if you pushed him. "Ma'am, can you tell me exactly what the emergency is here?" Karen blinked rapidly. "Well, I told dispatch there were strangers parked outside my house. They were refusing to leave, and I didn't know what they were doing here." Mike gestured toward the street. "This is a public road." "Correct." Karen hesitated, clearly realizing she'd just stepped onto thin ice. "Well, yes, but the HOA, ma'am," Mike said, cutting her off. "The HOA does not have jurisdiction over public roads, and you have no authority to demand someone move their vehicle if they're not breaking any laws." Her mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "I was just trying to keep the neighborhood safe." Mike's voice stayed level, but there was no mistaking the edge. By harassing a pregnant woman and making a false emergency call to 911, a couple of neighbors gasped. One man actually took a step back into his doorway. Karen's face flushed crimson. That's not what Mike didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Ma'am, we'll need to take a statement from you and from the complainants, but I suggest you think very carefully before you say another word." The entire street was silent except for the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. Karen looked like she was shrinking under his gaze. And I knew. The real show was just getting started. Karen's eyes darted left and right, like she was looking for an escape hatch that didn't exist. The audience, the neighbors who had peeked from behind blinds and half-closed doors, was no longer pretending to be discreet. A few had stepped onto their porches, arms folded, clearly enjoying the show. Mike stood tall, arms loose at his sides, but I knew that posture he was in full command mode. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "when you called 911, you reported an emergency. You understand that false reports are a criminal offense." Karen's voice went up half an octave. "It was an emergency. I didn't know these people. How was I supposed to know they weren't?" "Trouble." Mike raised one eyebrow behind his sunglasses. "You mean the man you're speaking to right now, who happens to be an honorably discharged Army veteran, and his 8 months pregnant wife?" I caught the murmur ripple through the gathered neighbors. A couple of them looked straight at Karen with something between disbelief and disgust. Karen's lips tightened. "Look, I'm just doing what's best for the community. We've had strange cars here before. I'm on the HOA's safety committee." "That's funny." One of the neighbors called from across the street. "Didn't you get kicked off that committee last year for harassing the mailman?" A few chuckles escaped from the crowd. Karen whipped her head toward the voice, her glare sharp enough to cut glass. "That was different," she snapped. Mike didn't even flinch. "Ma'am, I'll need your ID for my report." Karen bristled. "Why, I'm the one who called, and I'm the one investigating whether you just abused emergency services." Mike replied, "ID, now." Her cheeks flushed a deeper red as she rummaged through her oversized purse. Every second she spent searching seemed to weigh heavier in the air. Emily, still seated in the car, watched quietly, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. Finally, Karen handed over a driver's license. Mike studied it briefly, jotting something in his notebook. "All right, Miss Waverly," he said, "while I finish my notes. Why don't you explain clearly what made you think this was an emergency?" Karen hesitated, glancing at the faces watching her. I could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. She wanted to spin a story, but the problem with an audience was that some of them had seen the whole thing from the start. They parked in front of my house," she said finally, "and they looked suspicious." Mike tilted his head. "Suspicious." Could you define that for me? Karen floundered. Well, he was just standing there. And she is my pregnant wife. I cut in, my voice calm but caring enough to reach every porch on the street. She'd been in the car for half an hour and needed to stretch her legs. Mike let the silence stretch. Karen's gaze skittered across the street, but no one was meeting her eyes in solidarity anymore. Ms. Waverly, Mike said finally. Do you know that 911 dispatch has a recording of every call and that when we review those calls, we note the caller's tone, language, and any exaggerations? Karen stiffened. I didn't exaggerate. Mike flipped his notebook shut. You claimed a man was acting aggressive toward you. I've been here for less than 5 minutes and already spoken to 3 neighbors who say you approached them in the same way, loud, accusatory, and without cause. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. I could see a woman 2 houses down raise her phone recording, no doubt. It wouldn't surprise me if half the block had their cameras rolling. Mike stepped closer, not threatening, just enough to ensure she was paying attention. I'm going to make this clear. This is a public street. They have every right to park here. You had no legal grounds to demand they leave. And you certainly had no right to harass a pregnant woman. Karen's jaw twitched. I was protecting the neighborhood. Mike's tone hardened. You were protecting your ego. That's not my department's job to enforce. The neighbors' murmurs grew louder. A man in a red flannel shirt called out. She's done this to my daughter too, called the cops when she was dropping off groceries. Another voice chimed in. Remember when she accused the UPS guy of stealing her plants? Karen's head snapped around like she was swatting at invisible flies. That's all lies. I'm the only one around here who actually cares about safety. But the tide had turned. Where before she had commanded the stage, now she was just another loud voice drowning in a chorus of disapproval. Mike let the noise settle before speaking again. Ms. Waverly, here's what's gonna happen. I'll be filing a report on this incident, and I'll be forwarding it to both the HOA board and the county prosecutor's office for review. Depending on their findings, you may be cited for misuse of emergency services. Do you understand? Karen's lips moved soundlessly before she finally muttered, Yes. Mike handed back her license. Good. You're free to go. And I suggest you spend the rest of the day doing something productive. Karen clutched her purse and turned sharply on her heel, muttering something under her breath as she stomped toward her front door. But halfway there, she paused and looked back at me, eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. I knew that look. She wasn't done. Karen disappeared into her house with the same kind of energy you'd expect from someone slamming a door behind them. But the moment she was gone, the neighbors' chatter swelled, filling the crisp autumn air like the low hum of a crowd before a big play. Mike turned to me, his expression softening instantly. You okay? I nodded toward Emily. She's the one I'm worried about. He stepped back over to her side of the car, lowering his voice. Ma'am, do you want an EMT to check you out? No trouble at all. Emily shook her head. I'm fine now, just didn't expect to get ambushed in a neighborhood like this. Mike gave a small, understanding smile. Unfortunately, I know this street's reputation. Then he looked over his shoulder at the people still watching from their porches and driveways. One of the neighbors, an older man with a faded Navy cap, called out, Commander Harris, good to see you again. Mike raised a hand in greeting. Good to see you too, Bob. Karen must have heard that from inside because the blinds on her front window twitched. A shadow moved behind them. I could almost imagine her brain trying to piece together the puzzle. Commander as in, not just a cop, but someone in charge. Mike straightened and spoke loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. I've known John here for over a decade, served with him overseas before I took this job. He's one of the most disciplined and respectful men I've met, and that's saying something. Considering my line of work, a couple of neighbors murmured, clearly impressed. Others looked like they'd just realized they might have picked the wrong side by staying silent during Karen's performance earlier. Mike took a step closer to me. I'll have the report on my desk by tomorrow morning. I'm going to personally review that 911 call. If there's even a hint of malicious intent, I'll make sure it gets forwarded to the prosecutor's office. I kept my tone even. I'm not looking to cause trouble, Mike, but I'm not letting her get away with this either. My wife doesn't deserve that kind of treatment. He nodded once. I know. And I'll make sure she doesn't. Just then, the blinds on Karen's window moved again this time. They didn't close right away. Instead, Karen actually stepped onto her porch, arms crossed, trying to look composed. Mike spotted her. Ms. Waverly. He called out, "Why don't you come back out here for a moment?" Her head jerked back slightly, but she walked toward us, heels clicking again. This time, there was no confidence in her stride, just defiance trying to pass as authority. When she stopped a few feet away, Mike gestured toward me. "Do you know who this man is?" Karen's eyes narrowed. "I know he doesn't live here." Mike ignored the jab. "He's a decorated Army veteran. Served this country for 2 decades. I served alongside him in combat. He saved lives more than once. And you decided to call 911 on him because he parked legally on a public street with his pregnant wife in the car." Karen's lips tightened into a thin line. She glanced around, probably realizing every neighbor within earshot was absorbing every word. Mike wasn't done. "Ma'am, I take it personally when someone abuses emergency services to harass decent people. It wastes taxpayer money, ties up resources, and erodes trust in the system. Do you have anything you'd like to say to them?" He didn't just mean us. He meant the entire audience of neighbors now hanging on every word. Karen shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I might have overreacted," she muttered. Mike's tone was still even, but there was steel beneath it. "That's one way to put it. Another way would be that you filed a false report and harassed a pregnant woman without cause." The Navy cap neighbor shook his head. "Not the first time she's pulled something like this," he muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Karen's face flushed again. "I said I overreacted. What more do you want?" Mike stepped forward just enough that she had to tilt her chin up to meet his gaze. "What I want is for you to understand this. If you pull something like this again on anyone, there will be legal consequences. Do I make myself clear?" Karen swallowed. "Yes." "Good," Mike said, taking a step back. "Now go home." She turned sharply and headed back to her porch, but not before throwing me a look that promised this wasn't over in her mind. I wasn't worried, because if Karen wanted to play games, she was about to find out that I could play them better and by the rules she'd never bothered to learn. Emily looked at me from the passenger seat, one eyebrow raised. "You're not just going to let it drop, are you?" I smiled faintly. "Not a chance." The truth was, I'd already started thinking ahead. This wasn't just about the rude encounter anymore. It was about making sure Karen thought twice before pulling this on anyone else. And thanks to my background, my connections, and a little bit of patience, I had all the tools I needed. That night, after we got home, Emily curled up on the couch with her tea while I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop. She was calmer now, but the look in her eyes told me the incident was still eating at her. "I'm fine." "Really?" she said when she caught me watching her. "I just can't believe someone would go out of their way to humiliate a stranger, especially when they can see I'm pregnant." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "It's not just about us. People like Karen don't stop until someone makes them. And I think I'm going to be that someone." The truth was, I had a unique advantage. Years in the military had taught me patience, strategy, and how to gather intel quietly. Plus, I still had plenty of friends in law enforcement, city planning, and even code enforcement folks who didn't take kindly to busybodies misusing the system. First, I called Mike the next morning. "You still got that HOA contact list from your community liaison meetings?" He chuckled. "You know I do. And you know I can't just give you their numbers. I'm not asking you to." I interrupted. "But maybe you could point me toward the right public channels to, say, request certain HOA records." "Ah," he said knowingly, "you're going the legal route." Smart. By lunchtime, I had already submitted a formal request to the HOA board for their public meeting minutes, rule enforcement logs, and violation reports. Under state law, certain HOA documents were public to residents and interested parties. Karen had no idea, but every complaint she filed and every time she overstepped was a matter of record. While waiting for the paperwork, I did a little more digging. It wasn't hard to find the neighborhood's Facebook group public posts full of smiling block party photos, yard sale announcements, and a few thinly veiled rants from Karen about keeping our streets safe from outsiders. The comments were telling. People were polite, but you could read between the lines Karen wasn't universally liked. Some neighbors clearly saw her as a nuisance. That meant, if I played this right, I wouldn't be the only one pushing back. 2 days later, the HOA packet landed in my inbox. It was like opening a treasure chest. Karen's name was everywhere, pages and pages of complaints she'd filed over the past 2 years. Parking violations, lawn too long reports, suspicious delivery drivers, even a bizarre one about a foreign-sounding man walking his dog. She'd targeted nearly half the neighborhood at one point or another. And here was the kicker. Multiple complaints had been dismissed outright by the board because they were unfounded. In a few cases, she'd even been formally warned about harassment of residents and misuse of HOA authority. I didn't have to fabricate anything. Karen had built her own case file, brick by brick. That weekend, I paid Frank a visit. Over coffee at his kitchen table, I slid the folder across to him. His eyes widened as he flipped through it. "Wow," he muttered. "This is worse than I thought." She went after the Wilsons for painting their door the wrong shade of blue. I grinned. I'm thinking of bringing this to the next HOA meeting. Public record, after all. And if a few other neighbors decide to speak up, well, maybe the board will finally do something. Frank leaned back in his chair, already smiling. "You won't have trouble finding volunteers. I can think of 5 people off the top of my head who'd love to see her taken down a peg." We spent the next hour making calls quietly, selectively. We didn't frame it as revenge. We framed it as concern about misuse of HOA rules and harassment of residents. That phrasing was important. It wasn't personal. It was about the good of the community. By Monday night, we had a plan. The next HOA meeting was in 2 weeks. Plenty of time to make sure the right people attended, armed with their own stories. And just to make sure Karen didn't see it coming, I kept my interactions with her non-existent. No glares across the street, no snide comments. If I passed her house while visiting Frank, I nodded politely. Let her think I'd moved on. She had no idea she was about to walk into the biggest public embarrassment of her HOA career. Emily, ever the voice of reason, asked me that evening, "Are you sure you want to go through with this? I mean, what if it gets ugly?" I smiled. "It's already ugly. I'm just making sure the truth gets aired in the right room, in front of the right people." And in my mind, I could already picture it, the moment when Karen realized she was surrounded not by allies, but by neighbors ready to hold her accountable. The night of the HOA meeting was unseasonably warm for late October. Emily decided to come along, saying she wanted to see the look on Karen's face herself. I made her promise to stay seated and calm. This wasn't about stress for her. This was about closure. Frank met us outside the community center centrage. The parking lot was already filling up, and small clusters of neighbors were chatting in low tones. I could tell from their sideways glances toward the entrance that they knew tonight might be more interesting than the average budget and lawn maintenance meeting. We walked in together. The meeting room was plain fluorescent lights, beige walls, a long table at the front where the board sat. Karen was already there, perched 2 chairs from the president, wearing a blazer like she was attending a Senate hearing. She caught sight of me and Emily and stiffened, her eyes narrowing into slits. The president, a thin man with a mustache that looked too big for his face, called the meeting to order. First item, community safety concerns. Karen immediately raised her hand, and before being called on, she stood. "Yes, I'd like to address the increasing problem of unknown vehicles parking on our streets. Just last week, I had to call the police on a suspicious couple. That was my cue." "Excuse me, Mr. President," I said, standing slowly, since that suspicious couple was my wife and me, and since the police commander himself came out to set the record straight. Perhaps we should hear the full story before we jump to conclusions. The room shifted, chairs squeaked, heads turned. Karen's lips pursed so tightly they almost disappeared. "I'm John Peterson," I continued. "I'm a resident of this town, a veteran, and that woman you targeted is my 8 months pregnant wife. We parked legally on a public street for less than 5 minutes when Ms. Waverly here decided to accuse us of being criminals and call 911. The police confirmed we had broken no laws, but that's not the real problem, is it? I reached into my folder and pulled out the stack of HOA records. The real problem is a pattern of harassment, false complaints, and misuse of HOA authority. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. I held up one of the papers. These are all public HOA documents. Anyone can request them. Over the last 2 years, Ms. Waverly has filed no fewer than 57 complaints against her neighbors, many of them dismissed as unfounded. She's accused the mailman of theft. She's reported delivery drivers for loitering. She even filed a complaint because someone painted their front door a color she didn't like. Frank spoke up from the back. Don't forget when she called the cops on my daughter for dropping off groceries. That got a few nods and a couple of chuckles. Karen shot to her feet. This is harassment. He's digging into my private affairs. I cut her off, my voice calm but carrying. Public records. Karen, every single page is documented by this HOA, and you've used your position, or at least the illusion of it, to intimidate people. That ends tonight. The board president looked distinctly uncomfortable. Ms. Waverly, is this true? Karen's voice shook. I was protecting the community. That's my duty. It's not your duty to lie to the police. Another neighbor said sharply, and it's not your duty to make people afraid to visit their friends here. The dam broke. One by one, neighbors stood and shared their own stories. A woman recounted being accused of illegal yard sales because her nieces were running a lemonade stand. A man in a flannel shirt told how Karen had threatened to have him arrested for leaving his work truck on the street overnight while he was working on a neighbor's roof after a storm. Each story chipped away at the thin armor she had left. Her face went from defiant red to pale. Tight-lipped silence. Finally, Mike walked in. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans and a polo, but everyone recognized him immediately. The room quieted as he strode to the front. Evening. Folks, he said, I won't take much of your time. I'm just here to confirm that the incident with John and his wife was a misuse of emergency services. We're reviewing the call, and if it meets the legal threshold for a false report, it will be referred to the prosecutor. I don't care if you're in the HOA or not. Nobody gets a free pass to harass their neighbors. Gasps. A few people clapped. Karen's head sank just a fraction, but it was enough. The board president cleared his throat. Given the number of complaints tonight and the history we've just been presented, I think it's appropriate to hold a vote on whether Ms. Waverly should be formally censured and removed from all HOA committees. It was almost comical. Every hand in the room went up, except hers. Karen stood abruptly, grabbed her bag, and stormed out without a word. The door slammed behind her. Emily leaned over and whispered, "That was beautiful." I just smiled. Justice served. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't the type to disappear quietly. And sure enough, I had the feeling this story wasn't quite finished yet. The night after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood's private Facebook group was on fire. Screenshots from the meeting had already made the rounds, Karen's stunned expression frozen mid-sentence. My stack of HOA records laid out on the table, and Mike's firm statement about harassment. Emily and I were sitting at the breakfast table the next morning when Frank called. "She's gone," he said, almost giddy. "Gone," I asked. "Packed up her SUV late last night. No goodbye, no explanation. Just loaded boxes into the back and left. Rumor is she's staying with her sister in another county for a while." Emily set her coffee cup down slowly. "You don't think she's coming back, do you?" I smiled faintly. "If she does, I doubt she'll have the same welcome committee." Over the next week, the neighborhood seemed lighter, like someone had lifted a weight off it. Frank told me people were friendlier to each other, chatting in driveways, even inviting newcomers over without fear of being scolded for breaking some imaginary rule. One afternoon, Mike stopped by my shop to pick up a coffee table I'd built for his wife. As he was loading it into his truck, he grinned. "By the way, the prosecutor's office decided not to file charges against Karen this time, but your report is in her file. One more stunt like that, and she's looking at real legal trouble." "That's all I wanted," I said. "A paper trail. Something she can't talk her way out of." Mike chuckled. "Well, you've got that now, and I have a feeling you've saved a lot of your neighbors some grief." Later that week, Emily and I went back to visit Frank and his wife. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon, and as we strolled down his street, several neighbors waved or stopped to chat. A woman I didn't recognize came up to us holding a small tin of cookies. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, smiling shyly. "I've lived here for 3 years and Karen made me miserable. I never thought anyone would stand up to her and actually win." Emily accepted the tin and smiled back. Sometimes it just takes one person to push back. And a very tall police commander. We all laughed. It struck me then how different the energy was compared to the day we'd pulled up and been ambushed. No tension, no suspicious glares, just neighbors being neighbors. As we walked back to the car, Emily slipped her hand into mine. "You know, when this all started, I thought you were going to make it worse. But you made it better. Not just for us." I squeezed her hand gently. That's the thing about people like Karen. They thrive when everyone keeps their heads down. Once you shine a light on them, they shrink. Before we left, Frank told me the HOA board had voted to amend their bylaws requiring that all complaints be backed with evidence and signed by at least one other board member before being submitted to authorities. In other words, no more one-person crusades. Emily and I drove home with the windows down, the autumn breeze carrying the scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. Karen hadn't apologized, and I doubted she ever would, but she'd been removed from her position of imagined authority. Her reputation was in tatters, and the community she tried to control was finally free from her constant surveillance. And, to me, that was justice enough. If there's one thing I learned from this whole mess, it's that bullies come in all shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're on a playground, and sometimes they're wearing a blazer at an HOA meeting. But the way you deal with them is the same. You stand your ground, you follow the rules, and you let the truth do the heavy lifting. You don't have to yell, you don't have to stoop to their level. And you don't have to fight alone. When you do the right thing, people will stand with you even if they're quiet at first. So, if you've ever had to deal with a Karen in your neighborhood, tell me your story in the comments. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next time we take a bully down the right way. Because trust me, in this community, justice will always be served.